The autumn evening painted the suburban streets of Clayton County in hues of amber and gold as Judge Sarah Mitchell's Mercedes eased to a stop along Maple Drive. The clock on her dashboard read 7:45 p.m. Another long day at the courthouse had stretched well beyond normal hours. Through her rearview mirror, the red and blue lights of a police cruiser pulsed rhythmically, casting strange shadows across the manicured lawns of the upscale neighborhood. Sarah released a tired sigh, her fingers drumming absently against the steering wheel. After 12 years on the bench, she'd grown accustomed to late nights reviewing case files and deliberating over complex legal matters. Today had been particularly challenging. A high-profile police misconduct case that had drawn significant media attention. The irony of being pulled over now wasn't lost on her. Her judicial robes hung neatly in the back seat, a silent testament to her authority that seemed strangely distant in this moment. She was dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, her natural hair pulled back in a neat bun, the picture of professional composure despite the exhaustion that tugged at her shoulders. Reaching across to the glove compartment, Sarah retrieved her registration and insurance information with practiced efficiency. Her law degree from Harvard and judicial credentials were also there. Force of habit from years of driving while black in America, even in this affluent suburb where she'd lived for the past decade. Through her side mirror, she watched the officer emerge from his patrol car. His stance was rigid, hand already resting on his holster, a detail that sent a familiar spike of anxiety through her chest despite her position and status. Sarah had presided over enough cases to recognize when an officer approached with preconceptions. The beam of a flashlight swept across her car's interior, lingering on the robes in the back seat without recognition. Sarah kept her hands visible on the steering wheel, the diamond ring on her left hand catching the light. A gift from her late husband, also a judge, who had always said that patience and dignity were their most powerful weapons against prejudice. She could see her house just 3 doors down, its warm lights offering an inviting glow in the gathering dusk. Her 16-year-old daughter, Kendra, would be wondering where she was. They had planned to discuss college applications over dinner. Sarah had promised to help her with her personal essay for Columbia Law, her alma mater's biggest rival, as she often teased. The cruiser's spotlight suddenly flooded her car with harsh white light, making the Harvard Law Review pin on her lapel glint momentarily. It was a small thing, but it had been a source of pride since her days as the first black woman to serve as its president. Now it felt like another detail that would go unnoticed in what she increasingly suspected would not be a routine traffic stop. Sarah took a deep breath, centering herself as she'd done countless times before delivering difficult verdicts. She knew the protocol better than most, not just as a judge, but as a mother who had carefully instructed her own children on how to handle police interactions. Keep your hands visible. Speak calmly. Move slowly. Document everything. Her phone was already recording audio, placed carefully on the passenger seat. The dashboard camera she'd installed last year was running too. Another sad necessity in these times. As the officer's footsteps grew closer, Sarah straightened her spine, embodying the poise that had earned her the nickname the Honorable Ice in her courtroom. What should have been a simple traffic stop was about to become something else entirely. A moment that would force Clayton County to confront uncomfortable truths about power, prejudice, and justice. But for now, Judge Sarah Mitchell simply waited, hands at 10 and 2, for the first tap on her window. Officer James Reynolds approached the Mercedes with the rigid posture of someone who'd already written his own version of events in his mind. At 32, he'd been on the force for 8 years, recently transferred from a rural precinct to this affluent suburb. His previous precinct had been less diverse, and his adjustment to Clayton County had been marked by several civilian complaints, all quietly handled internally. The tap on Sarah's window was more a pound, aggressive enough to make her wedding ring clink against the steering wheel. She pressed the button to lower her window, the cool evening air carrying the scent of fresh-cut grass and tension. Licensed and registration, Reynolds barked, his flashlight beam hitting Sarah's eyes directly, despite department protocols against such practices. And keep your hands where I can see them. Sarah squinted against the harsh light, but maintained her composure. Good evening, officer, she began, her voice carrying the measured tone that had settled countless courtroom disputes. My credentials, Air. Did I ask you to speak? Reynolds cut her off, his free hand still resting on his holster. License and registration. Now. In her rearview mirror, Sarah noticed a second patrol car pulling up. Standard procedure for this neighborhood, she knew, but the sight still made her stomach tighten. She reached for her documents with deliberate slowness, quietly grateful for the dashboard camera capturing every moment. I'm reaching for my credentials now, she narrated calmly, a practice she taught at countless community workshops on police interactions. They're in the compartment along with my judicial identification. Lady, I don't care if you're the Queen of England, Reynolds snapped, his voice rising. All I see is someone in an expensive car where we've had recent break-ins. Sarah's hand froze halfway to the glove compartment. Break-ins? In the 3 years she'd lived on this street, there hadn't been a single reported burglary. As a judge who reviewed local crime statistics weekly, she knew this for a fact. Officer Reynolds, she read his nameplate, her voice remaining steady. I live 3 houses down. I'm Judge Sarah Mitchell of the Clayton County Superior Court, and I'm happy to provide. The officer's laugh cut through the night air like a blade. Right, and I'm the Attorney General. His flashlight beam swept the car's interior again, pausing on her judicial robes. Nice costume. Now step out of the vehicle. Sarah's heart raced, but years of courtroom experience helped her maintain an outward calm. Officer, I'm complying with your requests, but I need to inform you that this interaction is being recorded, and I would like to speak with your supervisor. Reynolds's face hardened. Out of the vehicle. Each word carried the weight of escalating anger. You're being uncooperative, and I'm detecting signs of potential intoxication. It was an absurd accusation. Sarah hadn't had a drink in years, but she recognized the tactical language, the groundwork being laid for justifying whatever came next. Through her still-open window, she could hear the second officer approaching, footsteps crackling on fallen leaves. From her driveway 3 doors down, a motion sensor light clicked on. Her daughter Kendra would be watching through the window by now, probably already calling family friends on the force. But help from friendly officers would take time, and this situation was deteriorating by the second. Sir, Sarah tried one more time, her hand still hovering near her credentials. I am an officer of the court, and I'm requesting. The sudden grip of Reynolds' hand on her car door handle silenced her. His knuckles were white with tension, face flushed with what she recognized from countless testimonies as the dangerous cocktail of authority and assumption. In that moment, Judge Sarah Mitchell realized that all her years on the bench, all her achievements, and all her careful adherence to protocol might not be enough to prevent what was about to unfold. The door handle creaked under Officer Reynolds' grip as Sarah's heartbeat thundered in her ears. Her judicial temperament warred with rising panic as the situation spiraled beyond her control. Through years of handling high-pressure cases, she'd learned to read body language. Reynolds' stance screamed of a man looking for confrontation rather than truth. Last warning, Reynolds growled, his flashlight beam now fixed on her hands. Exit the vehicle, or I'll remove you myself. The second officer, whose nameplate read Garcia, hung back near the patrol car, looking uncertain but making no move to intervene. Sarah's mind raced through her options. As a judge, she'd sentenced countless individuals who'd made split-second decisions in moments like these. Now, she found herself navigating the same treacherous waters. Her credentials lay just inches away, but Reynolds' escalating aggression suggested he'd already decided what kind of story this would be. Officer Reynolds, she began again, her voice carrying the same authoritative tone that had silenced countless courtroom disruptions. I am reaching for my judicial credentials. They will confirm that I am Judge Sarah Mitchell of the Clayton County Superior Court." Her hand moved with deliberate slowness toward the glove compartment. Reynolds' response was immediate and explosive. He jerked the door handle, causing the Mercedes' frame to shudder. "Remove your hand from the compartment. Both hands on the wheel, now." In her peripheral vision, Sarah caught movement from her house. Kendra had emerged onto their front porch, phone raised, likely recording. The sight of her daughter witnessing this scene sent a fresh wave of emotions through her chest: fear, anger, and a deep, aching sadness. "My 16-year-old daughter is watching this unfold," Sarah said, forcing steadiness into her voice. "She's recording this interaction, as am I. I'm complying with your orders while attempting to identify myself. Please radio Lieutenant James Marshall. He can confirm my identity." The mention of a superior officer's name seemed to further agitate Reynolds. His face contorted with a mixture of suspicion and contempt. "Oh, now you know the lieutenant. Getting creative with these stories, aren't we?" He keyed his radio, but instead of requesting verification, he called for additional backup, citing an uncooperative subject making false claims of authority. Sarah's dashboard camera continued recording as Reynolds shifted his position, partially blocking her door from opening. The irony wasn't lost on her. Just hours ago, she'd been reviewing a case involving similar police tactics, where positioning and verbal escalation were used to justify subsequent force. "Step out now, or I'll add resisting to the charges," Reynolds demanded, his voice rising to carry across the quiet street. Neighbors' porch lights were beginning to flick on, drawn by the commotion. Sarah could see Mrs. Henderson, a retired civil rights attorney, emerging from her home next door, phone already raised. The second patrol car's spotlight suddenly swung around, bathing the scene in harsh white light. Officer Garcia finally stepped forward, his expression troubled. "Reynolds, maybe we should." "Stay back," Reynolds snapped at his partner. "She's reaching for something." His hand moved back to his holster, the implicit threat clear in the movement. Sarah's heart nearly stopped. In all her years on the bench, she'd heard testimony about moments like these. Moments where assumption and authority created a volatile mixture. She'd reviewed body camera footage of similar situations, some with tragic endings. Now she was living it, despite her position, despite her credentials, despite the very robe of justice hanging in her back seat. "I am a judge," she stated again, each word crystal clear and pitched to carry. "What you are doing is being recorded from multiple angles. I am complying with your orders while attempting to de-escalate this situation. Please state your probable cause for this stop and your justification for escalating it." Reynolds' response was to reach for her door handle again, this time with clear intent. The metal groaned under his grip as Sarah braced herself, knowing the next few moments would either validate or shatter everything she'd worked to uphold in her courtroom. The Mercedes' door flew open with a violent jerk, the cool evening air rushing in as Officer Reynolds used his full body weight to wrench it wide. Sarah's seatbelt, still fastened, was the only thing preventing her from being pulled out with the momentum. Her phone clattered to the floor, still recording. "Exit the vehicle now," Reynolds shouted, his face contorted with what Sarah recognized from countless testimonies as authority escalation, when an officer's pride overtook their training. His hand clamped around her upper arm, fingers digging into her suit jacket with enough force to leave bruises. "Officer, you are assaulting a superior court judge," Sarah stated firmly, her voice carrying the weight of hundreds of verdicts. "Release me immediately and step back." She remained seated, one hand still visible on the wheel, the other now gripping her seat for stability. From the porch, Kendra's voice cut through the chaos. "That's my mother. She's a judge." The teenager's voice cracked with fear and fury, a sound that tore at Sarah's heart. Mrs. Henderson had moved closer, her own phone steady as she documented everything, her years as a civil rights attorney evident in her practice documentation. Officer Garcia finally stepped forward, his discomfort now visible. Reynolds, hold up. Maybe we should verify. She's resisting. Reynolds cut him off, tugging harder at Sarah's arm. Subject is combative and refusing to comply with lawful orders. His free hand moved to his radio, calling in a code that Sarah knew all too well from her bench. One that would bring rapid response units. The physical struggle intensified as Reynolds attempted to unbuckle her seatbelt with his free hand, his actions growing more frenzied. Sarah maintained her composure, even as her shoulder screamed in protest. Her judicial training kicked in. She began documenting out loud. Officer Reynolds is using excessive force, attempting to remove me from my vehicle without probable cause or proper identification check. The time is 8:03 p.m. Multiple witnesses are present. I am stating clearly, I am Judge Sarah Mitchell of the Clayton County Superior Court. More lights flicked on along the street. The Garcia family from across the way emerged. Their daughter was one of Sarah's law clerks. Mr. Garcia was already on his phone, likely calling the courthouse directly. The neighborhood, once quiet, now hummed with urgent voices and the sound of approaching sirens. Reynolds's grip tightened further, and Sarah felt her suit jacket tear at the shoulder. Stop resisting, he shouted, though she hadn't moved except to brace herself. His face was inches from hers now, spittle flying as he yelled. Out of the vehicle now. Sarah's mind flashed to the cases she'd presided over. How many times had she heard these exact words in testimony? How many times had she seen the aftermath of such moments in evidence photos? Yet here she was, a judge in her own neighborhood, experiencing the very injustice she worked to prevent. I cannot physically comply without you releasing my arm, Sarah stated calmly, though her heart raced. You were causing injury and escalating a situation that could be resolved by simply checking my credentials. She could feel the bruises forming beneath his grip, tomorrow's evidence taking shape. The sound of screeching tires announced the arrival of more patrol cars. Sarah recognized the distinct engine sound of the department's Dodge Charger, likely a superior officer responding to the escalation calls. Through her windshield, she could see emergency lights painting the manicured hedges in strobing red and blue. Officer Garcia had drawn closer, his hand hovering near his partner's shoulder. Reynolds, back off. Something's not right here. But Reynolds was beyond hearing, caught in the momentum of his own aggression. In that moment, as neighbors gathered and cameras recorded, Sarah realized this incident would become more than a personal trauma. It would be a test case for everything she stood for in her courtroom. The next few seconds would determine not just her immediate safety, but potentially the future of police reform in Clayton County. The Dodge Charger's door slammed with authority, and Captain Diana Martinez emerged, her command presence immediate and electric. Even in the strobing emergency lights, her expression was clear, a mixture of recognition and horror as she took in the scene before her. Reynolds, her voice cut through the chaos like a blade. Stand down immediately. But Officer Reynolds, still gripping Sarah's arm, seemed trapped in his own momentum. Captain, the subject is resisting. Release Judge Mitchell right now. Captain Martinez's order cracked across the street like a thunderbolt. The effect was immediate. Reynolds's fingers went slack, his face training of color as the words Judge Mitchell finally penetrated his consciousness. Sarah remained seated, her dignity intact despite her torn jacket and throbbing arm. She'd seen this moment countless times from her bench, the instant when authority figures realized they'd made a catastrophic error in judgment. But experiencing it from this side was something entirely different. Your Honor. Captain Martinez approached swiftly, her face a mask of professional concern. I cannot begin to express. She turned to Reynolds, who had taken 2 stumbling steps backward. Officer Reynolds, surrender your badge and weapon to Officer Garcia. Effective immediately, you are on administrative leave pending investigation. The neighborhood had become an impromptu courtroom, with dozens of witnesses now recording every word. Kendra had made her way halfway down the driveway, still filming, tears streaming down her face. Mrs. Henderson, the retired civil rights attorney, had moved closer, her legal pad already filled with neat annotations of everything she'd witnessed. Captain Martinez, Sarah spoke with the measured tone she used for delivering verdicts, though her shoulder throbbed where Reynolds had gripped her. I'd like to make a formal statement, but first, I need medical attention to document these injuries. She gestured to her arm, where bruises were already forming visible patterns through her torn sleeve. Reynolds stood frozen, his face ashen as the full reality of his actions began to sink in. Your Honor, I didn't. Officer Reynolds, Sarah cut him off, her voice carrying 2 decades of judicial authority. I strongly advise you to exercise your right to remain silent. As you should be aware, anything you say can and will be used in the proceedings that will inevitably follow this incident. Captain Martinez was already on her radio, calling for paramedics and internal affairs. Other officers on scene, who had arrived expecting to assist in an arrest, now stood at attention, their body cameras recording every moment of this unprecedented situation. Sarah's phone, still recording from the floor of her Mercedes, had captured every second. She reached down slowly to retrieve it, noting how every officer except Reynolds now stood at a respectful distance. The contrast was stark, from threatened citizen to respected judge in the space of 2 words from Captain Martinez. Mom. Kendra's voice broke through the tension. Captain Martinez nodded, and the teenager rushed to her mother's side, phone still recording. Sarah pulled her daughter close with her uninjured arm, feeling her shake with a mixture of fear and relief. Mrs. Henderson approached, legal pad in hand. Your Honor, I've documented everything. Timestamps, witness names, direct quotes. And I believe, she gestured around the street, we have at least 15 different video recordings of the incident. Captain Martinez stood at parade rest, her presence a shield between Sarah and Reynolds, who was now being escorted to a patrol car by Officer Garcia. The night air carried the sound of approaching sirens, paramedics, and, undoubtedly, more superior officers responding to what would become a landmark case in Clayton County. Judge Mitchell, Captain Martinez spoke carefully. Would you like to make your statement here, or would you prefer to do this formally at the station after receiving medical attention? Sarah looked around at her neighbors, her daughter, the gathering of officers, all witnesses to a moment that would transcend this single incident. Her response would set the tone for everything that followed. By midnight, Sarah's living room had transformed into an impromptu command center. The paramedics had documented and photographed the deep purple bruises blooming across her arm, while internal affairs investigators crowded around her dining room table, reviewing footage from multiple angles. The incident had already exploded across social media, with hashtags #Judge Mitchell and #Clayton County Shame trending nationally. The dashcam footage is clear, Lieutenant James Marshall stated, his tablet displaying the crisp video of Reynolds' aggressive approach. No probable cause for the stop, no legitimate reason for escalation, and clear evidence of excessive force. He'd rushed to the scene the moment he'd heard Sarah's name on the radio, but had arrived just minutes too late to prevent the altercation. Sarah sat composed on her sofa, ice pack on her shoulder, as Kendra curled protectively beside her. The teenager hadn't stopped trembling, though her social media savvy had already ensured that multiple copies of her video were safely uploaded and shared with proper authorities and trusted community leaders. 6 separate civilian recordings, Captain Martinez read from her report, plus 3 dashcam angles, 4 body cameras, and Mrs. Henderson's detailed written account. She looked up at Sarah, her professional demeanor cracking slightly. Your Honor, the department's response will be swift and comprehensive. The media had gathered outside, their satellite trucks casting long shadows in the street. Local stations had broken into regular programming to cover the story of a respected black female judge being assaulted by a white officer in her own neighborhood. The racial implications were impossible to ignore, especially given Sarah's reputation for handling police misconduct cases. "Mom," Kendra whispered, showing her phone. "Aunt Regina's video has 2 million views already." Regina Mitchell Harris, Sarah's sister and a prominent civil rights attorney in Atlanta, had immediately shared Kendra's footage with her substantial social media following, adding powerful commentary about systemic racism in law enforcement. Sarah studied the growing bruises on her arm, thinking of all the similar photographs she'd reviewed as evidence in her courtroom. "We need to get ahead of this narrative," she said, her judicial mind already working through the implications. "This isn't just about me. It's about every person who doesn't have a judge's robe hanging in their backseat." Mrs. Henderson, who hadn't left Sarah's side since the incident, nodded in agreement. The civil rights implications are staggering. Officer Reynolds' record from his previous precinct needs to be examined. This type of behavior doesn't develop in a vacuum. The police chief's call had come within minutes of the incident, followed by the mayor, the district attorney, and the state attorney general. Each conversation carried the same undercurrent of panic. This case had the potential to become a watershed moment for police reform. Judge Mitchell, a young internal affairs investigator, approached cautiously. Officer Reynolds' body camera revealed concerning comments he made to Officer Garcia before approaching your vehicle. He hesitated, glancing at Kendra. "My daughter stays," Sarah stated firmly. "She needs to understand everything about this system, both its flaws and how we work to correct them." It was the same principle she'd applied in her courtroom: sunlight as the best disinfectant. Outside, the media presence continued to grow. National networks were picking up the story. Black female judge assaulted by white officer in her own neighborhood. The simplicity of the headline belied the complexity of the situation. The intersections of race, authority, privilege, and justice that Sarah had navigated her entire career. Captain Martinez's phone buzzed continuously as police departments across the country began reaching out, knowing this incident would become a case study in bias training and departmental reform. The Clayton County Police Department's response in the next few hours would set a precedent for handling similar incidents nationwide. "Your Honor," Captain Martinez said softly, "how do you want to proceed?" "The chief is prepared to make a statement, but everyone agrees you should shape this narrative." Sarah looked around her living room, at the investigators documenting every detail, at her daughter still recording everything, at her neighbors gathered in support, and at the media circus growing outside. The system she'd served faithfully for decades had failed her tonight, but perhaps this failure could catalyze real change. The Clayton County Courthouse buzzed with unusual energy 3 days after the incident. Judge Sarah Mitchell's courtroom, typically a model of decorum, had become the epicenter of a national conversation about law enforcement reform. As she ascended the bench, her arms still tender beneath her robes, the gallery fell silent. "All rise," her bailiff announced, his voice carrying extra gravity. The Honorable Judge Sarah Mitchell presiding. The morning docket included 3 police misconduct cases. The irony wasn't lost on anyone present, especially the officers standing before her, their discomfort evident as they faced a judge whose own experience had become a viral testament to systemic bias. "Your Honor," District Attorney Marcus Chen approached the podium. "Given recent events, would you consider recusing yourself from cases involving law enforcement?" Sarah's response was measured, each word carefully chosen, knowing it would be quoted in law journals for years to come. "Mr. Chen, my personal experience has provided additional context, not compromised my ability to be impartial. The law remains the law, regardless of who sits on either side of it." In the back of the courtroom, a team from the Department of Justice took notes. The incident had triggered a broader investigation into Clayton County's police practices. Officer Reynolds' personnel file had revealed a pattern: 6 complaints of excessive force against minorities in his previous precinct, all quietly buried under bureaucratic paperwork. During the lunch recess, Sarah received a call from the police academy director. Judge Mitchell, we'd like to incorporate your case into our training curriculum. Your unique perspective, as both a judge and a victim of police misconduct, could reshape how we prepare future officers. The professional implications rippled through every level of the justice system. Defense attorneys cited her case in motions. Prosecutors reassessed their approach to police misconduct cases. Fellow judges reached out, sharing their own experiences with racial profiling, creating an informal support network that crossed jurisdictional lines. The system protected me because of my position. Sarah addressed a hastily assembled judicial conference that evening. But what about those without a judge's robe? Without cameras, without a neighborhood full of witnesses? The assembled judges, prosecutors, and law enforcement officials shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Officer Reynolds' disciplinary hearing was scheduled for the following week. The evidence was overwhelming. Multiple videos, witness statements, and his own body camera footage revealing comments that betrayed deep-seated racial bias. His union representative had already suggested he resign rather than face termination. Sarah's phone buzzed with a message from the state's Chief Justice. Your handling of this situation is exemplary. We're revising judicial security protocols and bias training requirements for court officers statewide. In her chambers, Sarah reviewed the latest statistics. Complaints against officers were up 50% since her incident went viral. People felt emboldened to speak out, to document encounters, to demand accountability. Her traumatic experience had created a crack in the blue wall of silence. Judge Mitchell, her clerk interrupted, the FBI Civil Rights Division is here for their appointment. The investigation had expanded beyond Clayton County. Similar patterns emerged in departments across the state. Officer Reynolds' previous precinct faced particular scrutiny. How many other officers had been transferred rather than disciplined? How many incidents had been buried under paperwork? Your Honor, the lead FBI investigator began, your case has become a catalyst for change. We're seeing departments voluntarily opening their files, implementing new training protocols, revising use of force policies. Sarah touched her arm, still bruised beneath her robe. Change comes at a cost, she replied. The question is, who usually pays that price? The day's final meeting was with Police Chief Thompson. He looked aged, haunted by the implications of what had happened on his watch. Judge Mitchell, we're implementing immediate reforms. Body camera footage reviews, implicit bias training, community oversight boards. Chief, Sarah interrupted, these shouldn't be reactive measures to a PR crisis. They should be fundamental to how we protect and serve everyone equally. As the sun set over the courthouse, Sarah gathered her things, preparing to head home. Her case had cracked open conversations that had been simmering for years. The professional consequences weren't just about one officer or one department. They were about transforming a system that had failed too many for too long. 2 months after the incident, Sarah sat in her home office, reviewing the latest draft of her victim impact statement. Outside, autumn had painted her neighborhood in rich golds and reds, a stark contrast to the night that had changed everything. Kendra lounged on the office sofa, working on her Columbia Law School application. Her personal essay now centered on witnessing justice and injustice collide in her own front yard. Mom. Kendra looked up from her laptop. They want you on National Morning next week. The producer says they'll focus on your advocacy work, not just the incident. Sarah considered the invitation, remembering how her initial silence had given way to a measured but powerful voice for change. Her speaking calendar was already filled with police academies, judicial conferences, and civil rights forums. Not as a victim seeking sympathy, but as a judge determined to transform a painful moment into meaningful reform. What do you think, sweetheart? Sarah asked her daughter. We made a pact to make decisions about public appearances together. The incident had affected Kendra deeply, nightmares about what could have happened, anxiety when police cars passed their house, but also a strengthened resolve to follow her mother into law. "I think you should do it," Kendra replied, her voice carrying a maturity beyond her 17 years. "But only if they let you talk about Officer Reynolds' rehabilitation program." The mention of Reynolds brought Sarah back to their unexpected encounter last week. She'd found him waiting outside her chambers, not in his uniform, but in civilian clothes, his face bearing the weight of 2 months' intensive bias training and counseling. "Your Honor," he'd begun, voice trembling, "I know nothing I say can undo what I did." She'd listened as he described his journey, the defensive anger giving way to shame, the counseling sessions that forced him to confront his biases, the community service that opened his eyes to the lives behind the statistics. Sarah's phone chimed. Another message from Regina, her sister. The family had rallied around her, but they'd also challenged her decision not to press criminal charges against Reynolds. Sometimes, she'd explained at a tense family dinner, true justice requires more than punishment. It requires transformation. The bruises had faded, but other marks remained. Sarah found herself double-checking her judicial robe was visible when driving home late. She'd installed additional security cameras around the house. The department had offered her a police escort, an irony that made her decline with a sad smile. "Judge Mitchell." Her assistant's voice came through the intercom. "Mrs. Henderson is here with the Community Oversight Committee draft." The retired civil rights attorney had become a frequent visitor, helping Sarah channel her experience into structural change. Together, they drafted proposals for civilian review boards, training reforms, and accountability measures that went beyond surface-level solutions. "Send her in," Sarah responded, then turned to Kendra. "Want to sit in? This is what real change looks like, not just policies, but people committed to enforcing them." As Mrs. Henderson entered with her signature legal pad, Sarah reflected on how the incident had reshaped not just her professional life, but her personal mission. She'd always believed in justice, but now she understood viscerally the gap between legal equality and lived experience. "Your Honor," Mrs. Henderson began, but Sarah raised a hand. "Sarah, please. We're not in court, and this is personal." The older woman nodded, understanding. They'd all become more than their titles: judge, attorney, student, officer. They were now part of something larger, a community determined to transform pain into progress. Later that evening, as Sarah reviewed Kendra's college essay, she paused at her daughter's concluding line. "I learned from my mother that justice isn't just about wearing a robe or wielding authority. It's about having the courage to stand firm when those symbols are stripped away, and the wisdom to help others rise when they fall." Sarah wiped away a tear, realizing that while the incident had shaken her faith in systems, it had strengthened her belief in the possibility of change. One person, one policy, one transformed perspective at a time. 1 year after the incident, the Clayton County Police Academy graduation ceremony broke with tradition. Instead of the police chief delivering the keynote address, Judge Sarah Mitchell stood at the podium, her presence both a testament to healing and a symbol of transformation. Among the graduating class sat James Reynolds, not as an officer, but as a newly certified police trainer in community relations and bias prevention. "Your journey begins at a crucial moment in law enforcement history," Sarah addressed the cadets, her voice carrying the weight of experience. 1 year ago, I was just another black woman being profiled in her own neighborhood. The robe in my backseat didn't protect me, but it did give me a platform to ensure that what happened to me serves as a catalyst for genuine change." In the audience, Kendra sat between Captain Martinez and Mrs. Henderson. Now a freshman at Columbia Law School, she'd flown home specifically for this ceremony. Her viral video of the incident had become required viewing in police academies nationwide, accompanied by a training curriculum that Sarah and Reynolds had helped develop. "Today, we celebrate more than new officers joining the force," Sarah continued. We celebrate a department that chose to transform crisis into opportunity. Officer Reynolds. Reynolds stood, no longer the angry man who'd attacked her that night. The past year had stripped away his defensive layers, revealing someone capable of profound change. He joined her at the podium, his voice steady as he addressed his former colleagues. "I was the problem we're trying to solve," he admitted. "My biases, my assumptions, my abuse of authority, they were symptoms of a larger disease in law enforcement. Judge Mitchell could have ended my career. Instead, she showed me how to transform it into something meaningful." The changes in Clayton County had become a national model. Body camera footage was now automatically uploaded to civilian oversight boards. Traffic stops required clear probable cause, documented in real time. The department's demographic data was publicly accessible, and community feedback shaped policy decisions. Sarah's phone buzzed. A message from the Attorney General. The federal guidelines she helped draft, incorporating lessons from her experience, had just been approved. The Mitchell Protocols would provide a framework for police reform nationwide. But institutional change is only part of the equation. Sarah addressed the cadets. True transformation happens in moments of choice. Each of you will face situations that test your training, your assumptions, and your character. Remember, behind every interaction is a human being deserving of dignity and due process. In the year since the incident, reported cases of police misconduct in Clayton County had dropped by 60%. More significantly, civilian complaints were being treated with new seriousness, and officers were more willing to report concerning behavior among their peers. After the ceremony, Reynolds approached Sarah and Kendra. His daughter, about Kendra's age, stood beside him. The two girls had become unlikely friends through their father's joint speaking engagements at schools, discussing the impact of that night from their unique perspectives. "Judge Mitchell," Reynolds said, "the California Police Chiefs Association requested our training program. They want us to present next month." Sarah nodded, remembering their first post-incident meeting. His shame, her anger, their mutual recognition that healing required more than apologies. They'd chosen to channel their experience into education, turning a moment of conflict into a movement for change. Mrs. Henderson joined them, her ever-present legal pad now containing notes for a book about the incident and its aftermath. "Your Honor, the Civilian Oversight Board just approved the final draft of the Community Policing Guidelines." The sun set over the police academy as families took photos with new graduates. Sarah watched Kendra laugh with Reynolds' daughter, their friendship a living testament to the possibility of healing across divides. The bruises had long faded, but their legacy remained, not as scars, but as foundations for bridges being built. "Ready to head home, Mom?" Kendra asked, gathering her things. "Dad would have been proud today." Sarah smiled, thinking of her late husband's favorite saying about justice being a garden that needed constant tending. As they walked to their car, several patrol cars passed by. The officers inside waved respectfully, not because she was Judge Mitchell, but because they understood the lesson her experience had taught them all. Justice, dignity, and transformation were interconnected paths to lasting change.